Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. In this episode, recorded on September 21st, 2015, Daniel and I discussed the Iranian nuclear program and its origins with Mr. Scott Horton, host of the Scott Horton Show. This is part one of a two-part series on the Iranian nuclear program and the Iran deal. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Iran-deal.
Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. Scott Horton about the Iranian nuclear program and the Iran deal. Mr. Horton is the host of the Scott Horton Show, which focuses mainly on foreign policy topics. You can follow his work and listen to his show at scotthorton.org, with Scott spelled S-C-O-T-T. You can listen to his show through the Liberty Radio Network at lrn.fm, by subscribing on iTunes, and through several other media outlets. You can find a full list of where to listen to the Scott Horton Show by going to scotthorton.org/listen. Hello.
How are you guys doing?
We're
Great.
doing well.
Okay, let's jump straight in. So, can you give us some background on the history of the Iranian nuclear program and what it has consisted of thus far?
Sure. Yeah, and that's kind of the best question to ask. Everything that you ever heard about it mostly was a bunch of war propaganda. Iran never had a nuclear weapons program ever. They've been members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty since the 1960s, and being a non-nuclear weapons state and member of the NPT means they swear never to get nuclear weapons by hook or by crook, making them or trying to buy them or anything else. And under the NPT, they have a safeguards agreement with the IAEA, which is the enforcement mechanism. So you're hearing all this stuff about inspections now. They've been under inspections all along. All nuclear material in Iran is declared and safeguarded by the IAEA, and they have always been verified to have not diverted any of their nuclear material to any military or other special purpose. They've never enriched to weapons grade. They've never had a nuclear weapons program. It's possible, although at this point I would say it's even unlikely, that there were some research projects in nuclear weapons in the very late 1990s, very early 2000s. But even Mossad and CIA agree that never really amounted to a nuclear weapons program, a decision to go ahead and move forward and make them, or anything like what would have been required in order to make them. And that any and all of that ended 12 years ago in 2003. And so the worst thing that you could say about it, and be honest, is that they're going for a nuclear capability, which is in military terms about half a nuclear deterrent, right? We have real nuclear weapons. You attack us, we will nuke you, right? That's our nuclear deterrent. Their nuclear deterrent is, well, we've mastered the fuel cycle. We know how to enrich uranium. If you bomb us, like you're always threatening to do, they haven't said this, but the implication is pretty clear. Well, at that point, we could then decide to start making nukes. And it would take, of course, a real full-scale invasion and occupation of the country to prevent them from ever having a nuclear program in those circumstances. So, in other words, the whole thing is a tempest in a teapot, a mountain out of a molehill kind of a situation, and really just for political reasons. The Israelis, remember, after the 1979 coup, when the Americans became the revolution against our coup, I should say, in 1979, when that made America an enemy of Iran, the Israelis were perfectly fine with it. And the Ayatollah kept a lot of the Shah's old intelligence apparatus, only, under new loyalty oaths and so forth. And they kept their relations with the Israelis. Remember when Ronald Reagan wanted to sell them weapons, he used the Israelis to sell them the weapons as the cutouts. Back when Reagan was backing both sides of the Iran-Iraq war, mostly Iraq, but also Iran, in order to get the hostages in Lebanon released and in order to make money to pay for the death squads in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And there's a little Iran-Contra history for you there. But anyway, so the Israelis always got along with the Iranians. They didn't have a problem with the Iranians. They're their Persian ally to help balance against all the Arabs, who they consider their actual enemies since, they're adjacent and have a history of actually going to war, whereas they've never had a war with Iran in any sense. Well, that changed in 1995 under Yitzhak Rabin, who's known as the peacemaker, who tried to give up the West Bank and the Gaza Strip occupations to allow a Palestinian state, and was assassinated by a Benjamin Netanyahu acolyte, a right-wing nationalist settler, who put an end to that so-called Oslo peace agreement, peace process as it was going forward. Well, at the time, Rabin needed a distraction from the fact that he was trying to do the right thing and end the occupation. So he started demonizing Iran in order to change the subject and say, hey, look, everybody, Iran. Well, after he was killed, Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Barak and Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert and now Netanyahu again, they have all continued the demonization of Iran, only instead of to distract against trying to do the right thing, it's to distract against the fact that they'll never do the right thing. They'll never give up the occupation. And anytime anybody says, hey, what about the Palestinians? They've been occupied longer than the Soviets occupied Eastern Europe. They say, Iran, nuclear, Iran, existential threat. And it's the giant distraction. And, of course, it's the Israeli fifth column led by the neoconservatives in this country that have made such a big deal out of the Iranian nuclear program. So now this current deal, what could be said about it, before anything else, would just be that it's completely unnecessary. We don't need this deal. This deal could be seen as basically just trying to get the Israelis to shut up. Now they're going from a safeguarded nuclear program to a vastly scaled back nuclear program with vastly expanded inspections and vastly expanded safeguards to make extra double super sure that they're not making nuclear weapons and are not even trying to. And so, which ought to put the issue to bed, basically, even though it was a fake issue in the first place. Now, hopefully that's out of the way, we can get back to a more normal relationship with Iran, which, by the way, does not mean that I support working with them in the Iraq war against the Islamic State, for example, or anything like that. I want to end our Cold War with them, not a new alliance. But anyway, and then if you want to get into the details of the nuclear program, I'd be happy to explain, a little bit more of the nuts and bolts. That's the background to this thing, is it's all basically just a bunch of political hogwash.
Yeah, so we'll get into the details of this agreement, but let's start out by getting into the details of their nuclear program. So some of the facilities that you hear mentioned from time to time are Parchin and Fordo and Natanz in Iraq and Merivin. Can you talk about what goes on and has gone on at those facilities within the broader context of their program?
Right. Okay, so yes, again, it is a civilian nuclear electricity program. They have mines, and they have their own capacity to refine the ore into what's called yellow cake. Remember from the old Saddam yellow cake scam from 2003, right. The refined uranium. Then they have to convert that, and they have a facility at Isfahan where they convert the yellow cake uranium into uranium hexafluoride gas. And it's the uranium in gaseous form that you feed into the centrifuges. And then as it goes through the centrifuges, the purpose of the centrifuges is, well, as you could guess, it spins them. And what it does is it separates out the different isotopes of uranium in the gas. Now, uranium is mostly, if the ore in the ground is mostly uranium-238. So when you spin it, what happens is the 238 goes to the outside, and the 235, which is the sweet stuff, the fissile material, and or, not necessarily, it's fissile at high enough percentages anyway. But the point is, that's the good stuff for fuel or for weapons, is the 235. So they separate out the 238, and as it spins through the cascades, it gets purer and purer. And it's a sliding scale. So in order to make electricity, all you need is 3.67%. Electricity grade, industrial grade. To make fuel plates for their, basically targets for the medical isotope reactors that Gerald Ford sold them back when their government was an American fascist sock puppet dictatorship under the Shah Reza Pahlavi in the 1970s. That's where they got their Tehran nuclear medical reactor, is from America. You have to enrich up to 20% for that. Well, to make a nuclear bomb, it has to be above 90%, and typically even above 94% uranium-235 to be weapons-grade material. And again, they have never done any of that, and it's a proven fact because the IAEA reports 10 times a year, or whatever it is, 6 times a year. The agency has continued to verify the non-diversion of declared nuclear material in Iran to any military or other special purpose. In other words, it's all still here. None of it's weapons grade. Everything's accounted for, kind of a thing, right? Then you have the Arak, A-R-A-K, Arak and the Bushehr reactors, which are both under the deal being converted to light water reactors, which means that their waste, it will still include some plutonium-239, but it'll be so in such small quantities and so polluted with other isotopes that it would be virtually impossible. That's the point of a light water reactor, is that its waste is virtually impossible to use for nuclear weapons purposes. Iran doesn't even have the facility that they would need to reprocess plutonium waste from a heavy water reactor in order to make nuclear weapons fuel. They sure as hell cannot. This is, again, just double extra making sure they have no plutonium path to a bomb here. It's completely cut off. Sorry, I know I'm mixing up answers to questions here, combining the deal and the program at the same time. But anyway, and then so Natanz is the underground facility where they do Natanz and Fordo both. Fordo is also called Qom because it's near the city of Qom, Qom, where they had the big earthquake back a few years ago. And so the Fordo facility and the Natanz facility are both enrichment facilities. This is where the gas goes through the centrifuges. Fordo is a much smaller facility. It's basically the backup, and it was built under a mountain. Under the deal, they've agreed to cease all enrichment of nuclear materials and just use it for research purposes, basically. It'll still be safeguarded, but there will be no nuclear materials being enriched at Fordo at all. Natanz is still going to be operating, but they're going from 20,000 centrifuges that they've got up and running up until now, and they're scaling that back down to just over 5,000. And they're also going to use up and or oxidize and make useless any uranium above the very smallest amounts in their inventory or in their stockpile. So they won't have a giant amount that you could even, use your imagination and say, well, they could enrich it further or something. They won't even have that. It's going to all be used up, this and that. Now, Parchin is, I'll do Marathon first because it's much easier to dismiss. Okay. The accusation is that they had done some experimentation out at Marathon, which is not a nuclear site. It's a military site in western Iran, where supposedly they had tested the implosion systems for a nuclear weapon. But as far as I know, there's no evidence of that. The rumors just came from the Mujahideen-e-Khalq communist terrorist cult, which works for the Israelis, and 99.99% of what they say is wholly false. So, there's basically no reason to believe in it. And the Iranians came right out and said, IAEA, come on out to Marathon. We got no problem. Please come and inspect. And the IAEA declined to even do it, seemingly because, in fact, I think somebody remarked it was because they didn't take the accusations very seriously in the first place. But the fact that the Iranians said, yeah, come on out and see what we got, and you tell me if you find anything, nuclear warhead suspicious out here. I think pretty well put the lie to it right there that it was a bunch of nonsense. Now, the accusations about Parchin are just as much nonsense, but only in more quantity. So the quality is the same, the quantity is bigger. There's this whole elaborate story about this test chamber where they're testing implosion systems for a nuclear weapon. Well, there are lots of problems with the story. First of all, again, it comes from the MEK, Mujahideen-e-Khalq communist terrorist cult that used to work for the Ayatollah. Well, first they were communists working against the Shah. Then they worked for the Ayatollah. Then they fought against the Ayatollah. Then he kicked them out of the country. They went to work for Saddam Hussein, where they helped crush the Shia and Kurd uprising, the Great Bay of Pigs of the Desert in 1991, when Bush Sr. urged the people to rise up against Saddam, and then left them high and dry. It was the MEK that helped Saddam crush the Kurdish part of the uprising there. And then ever since America invaded in 2003, they've worked for us and for the Israelis. And they're a bunch of complete lunatics. And again, virtually everything they say is a lie. And it totally is like a Bow and T, Heaven's Gate cult with, all the kids are kidnapped away and all the adults are forbidden from being married or having adult relations, and everybody has to raise their hand before speaking, and it's a complete it is a real cult in that crazy cult sense, the MEK. And again, they're always lying, and that's where the stuff comes from, and it's virtually a synonym for Mossad, just some Mossad propaganda. In this case, wholly and totally debunked. by Gareth Porter and also by Robert Kelly, Gareth Porter, the great reporter, and Robert Kelly, the former IAEA inspector, who just completely destroyed the entire thing. First of all, the pictures aren't pictures at all. It's a cartoon. It's a cartoon of what somebody says that he saw in a picture somewhere. And then the picture itself is of a test chamber that is of no design anybody's ever seen, except that, oh, wait a minute, here's a picture of a test chamber that is used for making nanodiamonds. And you can see where the guy who did the artist sketch of the supposed chamber at Parchin just didn't understand what he was looking at. So the original test chamber that was made for making, or not test chamber, but implosion chamber for nanodiamonds was sitting on a bunch of basically like railroad ties, big, thick rectangular wooden, beams basically. Well, the artist saw that and didn't know what he was looking at. And so he kind of thought that they were like these fins that went along the outside. So he went ahead and added a couple more on top for good measure so that it would look a little more symmetrical or something like this. You can see that. So he was copying, the artist was copying, the computer artist was copying a real picture, but not a real picture of anything at Parchin. A real picture of I believe a Russian chamber that's made for making nanodiamonds. And then part of the lie was that a former Soviet nuclear weapons scientist named Danilenko helped them do it. Except the funny thing is Danilenko is not a nuclear weapons scientist. He does have expertise in implosion systems, but again, and I think it is his chamber in the picture in Russia. He makes nanodiamonds for industry. He doesn't know anything about fission. He's not an expert in fission whatsoever. And they say former Soviet because they can't call him a Russian because he's Ukrainian. And America owns Ukraine right now. So that doesn't sound, at least most of the Western part of it. So that doesn't sound so nefarious. So they say former Soviet. But he wasn't a nuclear weapons scientist at all. And then Robert Kelly, the former IAEA inspector, and I really urge anybody who wants to check my footnotes on this. It's very well done at Loeb blog, the great Jim Loeb from Interpress Service. His blog, he has a piece called "The Parchin Puzzle" by Robert Kelly, where he just shows that even on the face of it, the paperwork doesn't make any sense. They commissioned the design and building of this thing, and they got it designed. They got all the materials together. They got it built, and they got it all put together in use. They started using it for their nuclear implosion testing all in the space of 1 year, huh? Yeah, anyway. It's done being debunked just when you tell the story told in the paperwork. Couldn't possibly be so. And guess what? That's not how you test an implosion system for a nuclear bomb anyway. You know how you do it? You do it like in the accusations about Marathon that are also fake. You do it outside. You have to, there's no, in the history of nuclear weapons programs, there's no, giant steel chamber that is used to test the implosion system for a plutonium implosion bomb. Again, not that they have any plutonium to implode. But the point of this, just like with, the ringed magnets, and, look, the nuclear explosion test chart, maybe. And, look, there's 10,000 leaks that have come out about Iran and their nuclear program. And that's probably not even an exaggeration. Like probably literally 10,000 stories in the Sunday Times of London here, the Washington Times there, Fox News here, and CNN there. And, and the Associated Press runs a guy named George John. And the New York Times runs David Sanger, who for years just referred offhand, out of context, to Iran's illicit nuclear weapons program. There was a meeting held in Geneva this week about what is to be done about Iran's illicit nuclear weapons program. And then Bob said to Cindy, blah, 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 right? Like, he never proves it. He just says that it's just a fact. For a decade, David Sanger wrote that in the New York Times. All of his lies. All of it is just basically a bunch of innuendo, but not even really a bunch of innuendo. Like the slightest innuendo, but pregnant with the idea that you don't know enough about nuclear technology to double check me, right? That's the basis of all of this stuff is what are you going to do? Look into it. What are you going to do? Figure out what the hell a safeguards agreement is and how it works? No. If we tell you to be afraid and we tell you to be afraid of nuclear, you're going to defer to us. Now, they learned this in the focus groups from the first Gulf War, really from the Cold War. But they learned this is how to get people on board for the first Gulf War. You got to tell them Saddam's working on nukes, and they'll go for it. And it's the same thing ever since then,
So, kind of following that idea, what have the previous negotiation attempts been, and what's America's card in the whole thing? Why do some countries want this idea of Iran having nuclear weapons?
Well, it's just the Israelis who, and there are people, I guess, in the American government who still aren't over 79. But really, the only reason the UN Security Council has gone along with this is at America's insistence, and America and Israel playing good cop, bad cop, where the Israelis threatened to bomb. And so then the Americans say to the French and the Germans, come on, man, help us out on these sanctions. And then we'll be able to tell the Israelis to cool their jets for a minute while we work on the sanctions and this kind of thing. So that's how they basically, gotten the world on board for it all. For the current set of negotiations, and the current set of sanctions that are now finally being lifted. But as far as the negotiations go, it depends on which direction you look at it from. I mean, after September 11th, the Iranians told the Americans, "Hey, we'll do anything we can to help you guys out," and they did help with the picking targets and this kind of thing, coordination for the war in Afghanistan against the Taliban, who they hated. They almost had a war themselves against the Taliban in 1998, and of course they hated and feared Al Qaeda, which wants rid of the Ayatollah more than Israel wants rid of the Ayatollah, of course. You want your Islamo-fascist caliphate. There's a gigantic Shiite-controlled Persia in the middle of, someday. So it's got to go if from Osama's point of view, of course. And they know that. So they're, certainly helped out. And there's plenty of documentation about the story of the first couple of years after 9/11 of how much they helped us out. At the very first, it was working great, but then Bush gave his Axis of Evil speech in the State of the Union at the beginning of 2002, and that kind of put a bit of a chill on it. But then right before the Iraq War, they sent what's called the Golden Offer through a Swiss diplomat. And what it said was, we want to talk with you guys about everything, man. We can deal about the nuclear issue. We can negotiate about oil deals and concessions. We can negotiate about our relationship with Hamas and Hezbollah. We're willing to pressure them to disarm and simply become political parties in the larger Palestinian and Lebanese system, et cetera, et cetera. You can read it online. The PDF is published online, Iran's Golden Offer. And I've talked at length with Flint and Hillary Mann Leverett. They're now a married couple. At the time, they weren't. They were both just Bush administration employees who resigned in disgust over the policy here because the Americans told the Iranians not just to go to hell, but they told the Swiss ambassador who dared to bring the peace offering to go to hell and gave him, the worst dressing down and got him, in trouble with the bosses back at the office and whatever. In New York for daring to have the temerity to come and bring this peace offer to the United States. And then the Bush-Cheney policy was, we don't talk to evil because, Bush and Cheney, so virtuous that they couldn't possibly be associated with evil men in any way. And so what they did was they had the E3, which is Britain, France, and Germany, were trying to negotiate from 03 through 05, and with sort of a kind of half permission from Bush to proceed, and we'll see what you come up with. And at that time, they didn't have a single spinning centrifuge. They had dug the hole in the ground at Natanz, but they didn't have a single centrifuge. They had agreed temporarily to the additional protocol, to their safeguards agreement, the same one they've only just now signed on to again. At that time, they voluntarily, even though it wasn't ratified by their parliament, they still went ahead and abided by it, as they put it, during good faith negotiations with the E3. But, of course, with the United States refusing to go forward, Bush and Cheney refusing to endorse what the Europeans were doing, the negotiations fell apart. And so the freeze ended. They quit the additional protocol and their subsidiary arrangements, and only then did they begin spinning centrifuges. Again, it's still for a nuclear program, but again, like I said, it's sort of a half military deterrent. It's a civilian program, but it has its implications, and so only then did they really start. And you wouldn't ever hear the Hawks admit any of this part of the story now as they cry about, Obama selling out to pure evil and whatever. But basically the entire Iranian nuclear program came into existence under the Republicans. And I don't just mean under Gerald Ford. I mean under Bush Jr. and Cheney in between 2005 and 2008. And then, of course, actually in 2005, Bush came out right before the election and gave a message directly to the people of Iran. You better not support the right winger or I'm going to be really mad. And then that's, of course, exactly what they did was they went out and supported Ahmadinejad. And then so Ahmadinejad was so toxic, with his loud mouth and his Holocaust denial and all this kind of thing. He made it perfectly, easy politically in America to just, to write off trying to deal. Oh, look, these people are too crazy to possibly deal with and all that kind of thing. Well, but then so Obama comes in and Obama says, I want a deal. Now, he completely blew the negotiations. The Israelis blew the negotiations in 2009, but Obama was only kind of half-assing it. Obama had promised the lobby, the Israel lobby, that is, that if we don't get a deal before the end of his first year in office, then he's going to slap on sanctions like the Iranians wouldn't believe. And I think he knew all along that he wanted to do that. He didn't want to take the heat from the lobby of being good on Iran in his first year and have to deal with that for the rest of his presidency. So I think he was willing to only kind of give it a half try. But what happened was they had a deal for a swap where the negotiation was going to really even basically begin at the Iranians giving up all of their 20% enriched uranium and swapping it out of the country to France if the French would then give them finished fuel rods that they could use in their reactor. And then, but the deal was, well, we got to swap at the same time, though. Not we give you our uranium and then we wait around for you to give it back in fuel rod form. And they had good reason for that because the French had burned them in the 70s on a deal very much like it, on some nuclear fuel. So that was the sticking point. And then when they were working it out in October of 2009, the Israelis, posing as CIA, hired, and I think CIA was probably in on it anyway, I don't know, but they hired bin Ladenite terrorists called Jandala in eastern Iran, and they live in Baluchistan there in the region of western Pakistan. And they kidnapped or, I guess captured and murdered a bunch of generals. I mean, imagine this in America. A group of terrorists kidnaps a bus full of generals and cuts their heads off. Generals, right? This is what the Mossad, at least, and maybe CIA, and maybe or maybe not with Obama's permission, had these terrorists do in Iran. So there's a huge uproar politically in Iran and a big turn against the deal. But then, and see, I think that actually it was the Israelis, with or without the CIA, working, without Obama's knowledge. Because the next thing Obama did was he turned around and he had Erdogan in Turkey and was it Silva in Brazil work out virtually the same deal again, a nuclear fuel swap. And then when it was announced that they had the deal, the Turks and the Brazilians had the fuel swap deal. It was in the beginning of 2010. Hillary Clinton came out and denounced it and said it was stupid and worthless and not good enough and talked a bunch of trash against the Ayatollah and all this stuff. And I think, was insubordinate and was undercutting the president. And at that point, he couldn't basically carry it forward any more than that. He was already past his deadline anyway. So then they went with the crippling sanctions, which have, of course, killed, uncounted people and caused untold suffering among the people of Iran between those years and now. And then it wasn't until they finally got rid of Hillary and brought in John Kerry that they finally started working on the negotiations. But even then, they had to drag it out and drag it out and drag it out just so that to try to, not that it really worked, right? But to try to undermine the talking point that, Obama's just desperate for a deal, right? So he had to make it look like he's playing hard to get all this time and whatever. When, again, we didn't even need this deal. We already got the non-proliferation treaty, and they were already safeguarded, and it was already cool in the first place. And they had to go through, basically this entire dog and pony show to take a civilian nuclear program and make it, instead of just safeguarded, double extra safeguarded.
Can you talk about the Stuxnet virus and the role the U.S. and the Israelis played in that?
Yeah, I'm not the number one expert on it, but I mean, you summed it up right there. Was the Americans and the Israelis worked together and unleashed this virus? According, again, it is David Sanger in the New York Times, so you got to take your pinch of salt when, he's got the best scoop on it anyway, I think, or the most in-depth scoop on it. I don't know about the best, but, basically what happened was they found a way to introduce this virus into the Natanz facility and into the computers that control the centrifuges in order to trick them into spinning too fast or spinning in a way that would cause an imbalance, while the computer readouts would still say that everything was fine. And then so what ended up happening was they had, major problems with parts of their centrifuge cascades, and they had major failures and I guess some, not really explosions, but might look like one if you were there, centrifuges ripping themselves apart and this kind of thing. And I think the Iranians tried to cover up the extent of the damage there. But there was quite a question, if I remember right, back in, say, like 2006, 2007. It would have been after that. I don't know. I'm correlating separate knowledge that I had of them having slowdowns in their expansion and that kind of thing. I'm trying to remember when the worst of the damage from Stuxnet would have hit. I guess they claim in 2010 or 11, right? But anyway, it didn't do that much damage. I mean, basically it set them back some, but they found it, they cleaned it out, but then it spread out to the rest of the world. So I don't know if it's ever been like tracked down and finally annihilated. I guess not. I've read that it, escaped out into the wild on somebody's thumb drive, as they put it, and that now it affects different industrial machinery and different industrial software around the world in different ways. But I don't really know enough about how it works. But, the thing of it is, and I'm glad that you brought this up because it sounds like a nothing topic the way we talk about it in context of all the rest of this stuff, with America and Israel constantly threatening to bomb Iran back into the Stone Age, basically. We hear about a computer virus being unleashed on them like this, and it's almost, it's a sidebar, and it's kind of even, almost comical or whatever. But that's only relatively speaking. If the shoe was on the other foot, and the Iranians launched a cyber attack against the United States that wasn't just, hacking GE's books or something like that, but they were hacking our nuclear centrifuge facilities and causing our centrifuges to explode and messing around with anything nuclear at any of our Sandy or Lawrence Livermore or any of these other type facilities. I mean, that'd be a war. We would absolutely be carpet bombing Tehran tomorrow morning if they tried that against us. And I'm not saying that would be legit. I'm just saying that's what the American government would do. That's how serious they would portray it to the rest of us. That could you believe what these people did to us? That would be absolute DEFCON 1. And yet when we talk about this is one of the things we did to Iran, it's like, well, that's not as bad as the time that the Israelis sent the MEK communist terrorist cult to assassinate all those scientists by, killing them with their families in some cases and that kind of thing. So just a little computer virus, right?
And look at the outroar over these purported viruses from China that they're always talking about.
Right, yeah. Mostly what they talk about with China is like, well, they hacked us and they stole our stuff. But what if the story about China was they hacked us and they started sabotaging our most sensitive industrial equipment, even in nuclear technology? I mean, I don't know if I guess they wouldn't bomb Beijing because Beijing can shoot back. But right. Still, though, I mean, the point being, they scream bloody murder at the slightest suggestion that any foreign government would do any kind of computer hacking of any kind between Canada and Mexico.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.